Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, you're either enrolled in my class or you stumbled across them in YouTube by using the inner Google, okay? If you found them on YouTube and you're not enrolled in my class, please know that I'm covering the material the way that I want my students to learn it, not the way that your instructor may cover it. Please make sure you learn it the way that your instructor wants you to learn it. If you find my videos helpful in understanding that stuff, then please hit like and subscribe. If you're in my class, hit like and subscribe, and every time I load new videos, it will inform you, okay? Now, today's lecture is going to be the very first lecture for lecture test 2 in what we're calling histology, the study of tissues. So, you've already completed lecture test 1. This is our histology lecture. Actually, I'm hoping you're watching this video well before then. Now, if you're in my class, we have 6 lecture tests, but we only have 4 lab tests. And so we have to cover more material on a lab test, and there's a little overlap into lecture test 1 from lab test 1. What we do in lab for test 1 is we're going to study the structures of the tissues. In lecture, we're not covering the tissues on lecture test 1. We're just not. We stop at mitosis and we're done. For lecture test 2, we pick up on tissues and histology and we start studying that. So, please know that this might seem a little out of sync, but I hope you watch this lecture, my histology lecture, before you do the histology lab. And I'll put a note in there when I post these videos. Now, I have a little frog in my throat. Please bear with me. It keeps getting irritated the more I talk. So, when it comes to the tissues of the body, histology is the study of tissues. And we've been working our way up through the levels of organization. We went over all the language of anatomy and body regions and directional terms and parts of the cell. But there was a chapter on chemistry. And as you know, atoms are sort of the smallest, they call them the smallest stable units of matter. Their stability is debatable, but nonetheless, atoms come together to form molecules and chemicals. Molecules and chemicals come together to form organelles. Organelles form cells. Cells form tissues. Tissues form organs, organ systems, and organisms. In order for us to understand the organs and how the body works, we need to understand the tissues that each organ is made out of or made up of. In the human body, there's only 4 major tissue types. And I'm going to follow along in my note set. I actually don't have my note set on me today, so I don't know what page we're on in the note set, but it's the first page under Unit 2, Histology. So, the first thing you need to know is that histology is the study of tissues. The second thing you need to know is that there are 4 major tissue types in the human body, and only 4. Each one has several subtypes, which is what we'll work up to, but for now, you need to know what are the 4 major tissues of the human body. And I'm going to switch markers because that one is dying on me. So the 4 major tissues of the human body. The first one is called epithelium. It's an I. Also called epithelial tissue. We abbreviate it as ET a lot of times because we don't want to always write it out. Epithelium and epithelial tissue are the same thing. The epi part means the upper or outermost, and thelia refers to leaves or scales, and so it's our outer covering. And what I want you to know about epithelial tissue is that it does just that. It covers and lines the surfaces of the body. And when I say surfaces, I mean the internal and the external surfaces. There's a rule of thumb for epithelium. If I can reach in from the outside world and touch it, I'm touching epithelium. All of my skin, the covering of my eyeball, when I put a contact lens in, it's sitting on the epithelium. If I stick my finger in my ears, in my nose, in my mouth, all those cavities that go into the body, the urethra where urine comes out, the vagina, the anus and rectum, since you can reach in from the outside world and still rub it or tickle it or touch it, it's covered with epithelium. As a matter of fact, if I swallowed a piece of string and it came out the other end and I flossed my body, it would be touching epithelium all the way through the body, okay? We are one big funny shaped donut. There's a hole that goes from this end, to that end. Okay, so as a matter of fact, if you stood naked on a mountain in a high wind at just the right angle, you would whistle as wind blows through. Just kidding. Probably shouldn't even say that, but nonetheless. So epithelium lines all the surfaces of the body, internal and external. It even lines the internal chambers of the heart. It lines the lining of your blood vessels on the inside where blood flows. Any internal and external surfaces, even the body cavities where the serous membranes are, lined with epithelium. Now, I'm going to get into more detail into the functions of them, but this is the basics. The next type of tissue is called connective tissue. And we abbreviate connective tissue as CT a lot of times. Connective tissue provides a structural framework for the body. That's its basic function. It connects or holds everything together. If I think about a house that's being built and you see all the 2x4s in the framework, that's the connective tissue. It's bones, it's ligaments and tendons, and a lot of the structural framework of the body. And of course, if you start to break those boards, the house would come tumbling down. If I pulled all the bones and ligaments and tendons out of your body, you would flop on the floor like a big bag of pond water. There's some other functions of connective tissues. They also interconnect the other tissues by storing nutrients and letting things flow from one tissue to another. We're going to look at that detail, but that's the basic function. There's muscle tissue. Muscle tissue's basic function is that it will contract. And when I say contract, that simply means to shorten in length. To move things. And I'm going to keep it simple and very general right now by saying to move things, because that's what it does. It moves your body and moves things within the body. There's 3 different types of muscle tissue we will talk about in the future. Skeletal muscle is attached to your skeleton and your bones. If you raise your hand or walk across the room, that's skeletal muscle. The muscles contract to move your bones. There's cardiac muscle, which is found only in the heart. Your heart is an empty chamber, 4 empty chambers, like putting a bunch of fluid in my hands. If I squeezed really hard, the fluid would shoot out. That's what your heart does. It contracts to pump blood through your blood vessels. And then we have smooth muscle, which is found on the walls of viscera. So sometimes it's called visceral muscle. Smooth muscle is found in the walls, of my respiratory tract. It can contract and constrict and dilate the tubes, letting more or less air in. It's found in the walls of blood vessels. It controls the movement of blood flow. So if I dilate one vessel and constrict another, I can shift blood from one part of my body to another. It's found in the walls of the digestive tract and all of the soft organs, or many of the soft organs and glands. So it's what contracts to keep food moving through the digestive tract and forces it out the other end, whether I want to or not. And smooth muscle is also found in glands. It will squeeze the glands to release the juices through secretion, like salivary glands and reproductive glands and digestive glands. So, sweat glands. So muscle tissue, no matter which type it is, all muscle tissues contract to move things. The last kind of tissue we can talk about is called neural tissue. Your nervous system. Neural tissue carries carries information within the body in the form of what we call electrical impulses. Those electrical impulses, by the way, I'm going to change markers for a second because that one's not writing very well any longer. But those electrical impulses are called action potentials. And we're going to learn more about them one day than you ever wanted to. So listen, you guys need to know the 4 major tissue types, and you should be able to list them right off the top of your head. It's a famous biology question. Which of the following are the 4 major tissue types? Epithelium, connective, muscle, and neural. Now, the basic function of all epithelium is it covers and lines surfaces of the body. We're going to go into more detail into its functions. Connective tissues provides a structural framework and connects all the other tissues together. Muscle tissue contracts or shortens in length to move your body and move things within the body. And neural tissue carries information within the body in the form of electrical impulses called action potentials. This is how I think about it. If the framework, the studs and the 2x4s that build up a house are the connective tissue, then the epithelium is sort of the sheetrock and the paint and the bricks and the paint and all of the external coverings. The shingles of your roof would be epithelium. All the coverings on the inside and the outside. Muscle tissue is the stuff that's doing things, a washer and a dryer and a dishwasher and your heater and your AC. It's all the stuff that's performing functions. And neural tissue is the wiring, the electrical wiring, so that when I flip a switch, a light comes on somewhere. Or I flip a switch and the garbage disposal starts. The wiring, the electrical impulses carried, telling it to turn on and off, is done by neural tissue, your nervous system. So those are the four major tissue types of the human body. You should know them and know their basic function. What we're going to continue to do is we're going to go through each one of these tissues in great detail. So there will be several videos of this. This video is going to focus right now only on epithelial tissue. And we'll talk about epithelial tissue, where it's found in the body, and what its functions are. Okay? Now, when I focus on epithelium, the things that I need to know about epithelial tissue is this. And I'm just going to put ET up here for epithelial tissues. There are three main things that we know about epithelial tissue. It covers and lines the surfaces of the body. And these are three little bullet points in my notes set. It covers and lines the internal and external surfaces of the body. Another thing that we know about epithelial tissue is it is avascular. A means not, and vascular refers to blood vessels. Epithelial tissues, excuse me, sorry. I'm not starting this video over. It's like the fourth time I'm trying to get this video done, and I've messed it up every time. So this time I'm just going to keep trucking. It is avascular. When you look under a microscope, most other tissues have blood vessels associated with them. Epithelial tissue is always avascular. It doesn't have any blood vessels in it. So if you're shaving and you nick yourself and it doesn't bleed, you've only cut the epithelium. Once you see blood flowing, you've gotten down to the underlying connective tissues and things. So all epithelial tissue is avascular. And it is attached to an underlying connective tissue. Now this is going to be true most of the time. There are a few rare exceptions. It is attached to an underlying connective tissue via or by what we call a basement membrane. Now I like to use the term basement membrane because it was used in biology and A&P for a long time, but now they like to use the term basal lamina, which has been used for a long time, but it's the Latin form of saying the basement membrane or the basal layer. So now, what does that mean? Well, there's a common theme in the human body. If I can reach in and touch it from the outside world, any opening, I'm touching an epithelium. If I could take a sharp instrument and poke through that epithelium, then always and forever, when I look under a microscope, if I see some kind of epithelial layer on top here, always at the base of the epithelium, and usually on slides it tends to stain this kind of bluish color, there's our basal lamina or basement membrane. And then underneath that is usually some big mess, a thick layer of some kind of connective tissue. It's a common theme in the body. If I took, a skewer. If I took this skewer and jabbed it through my arm here, or my abdomen, or my cheek from the inside or the out, it would poke through epithelium, basement membrane, connective tissue. If I did it from the lining of the stomach, or the thigh, or anywhere in the body, I'm gonna pass through an epithelium, a basement membrane, and connective tissue. Now there's a few rare exceptions to this, but we're not gonna learn those now. So what holds the epithelium on your body so it doesn't slide right off is this basement membrane attaches the epithelium to this underlying connective tissue. So I'm going to look at that basement membrane in some detail. By the way, I forgot to do this, but there are some other major functions of epithelium. Before I get to this, And they kind of represent the same functions that we saw for the cell membrane. Epithelium covers and lines the surface of the body. It isolates the internal environment from the external environment. It provides protection against abrasion, against harmful chemicals, and bacteria and viruses and pathogens from getting through our skin into our body. So it provides isolation, protection, controls permeability. Anything that enters or exits the body must pass through an epithelial lining before it gets to the outside world, or from the inside world to from the outside world in. Like your digestive tract. When you eat, stuff has to be absorbed through an epithelium into our blood vessels and then taken on to other parts of our body. So it controls permeability, isolation, protection, permeability, and it can provide sensitivity. We have a type of epithelium called neuroepithelium that is found in our nose and on our tongue that can taste and smell, and there's some in our ears for hearing. And so it does the same functions essentially as the cell membrane. Isolation, protection, controls permeability, provides sensitivity. It can also make secretions like sweat and saliva and mucus and all this other secretions. You should be able to list those functions. So they're in the note set, they're in the chapter. Make sure you open that up and you know the basic functions of epithelium. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this basement membrane in great detail because there's two layers to this basement membrane and it's very, very important. So let me erase this. Excuse me. Again, I'm sorry for coughing so much, but when you lecture as much as I've been lecturing, your vocal cords get irritated, and I've had some time off and now they're getting irritated. I also have two kids that play sports. My son's a big football player and star, and my daughter's a volleyball player, and she had a game last night. And I'm always talking and yelling and on the sideline cheering like crazy, and I'm very vocal. Anyway, please forgive me for this little cough I've developed. I'm not sick, I guarantee that. It's just simply irritated vocal cords. Now, for the basement membrane, I'm just going to put BM for basement membrane or basal lamina. Okay. One of the things you need to know about the basement membrane is it has two sublayers. The first sublayer is called the lamina lucida. Now, lamina means layer, lucid means clear. You can see through it under a microscope. The lamina lucida is an interconnected network of protein fibers. Those protein fibers are secreted by the epithelial cells, and they include glycoproteins and proteins and proteoglycans and all this stuff. Essentially, it's a thick protein layer, and it's a layer of protein fibers that are all interconnected. And its function is, I like to call it a sealer. Like, you know, some kind of water seal that you put on to prevent things from penetrating. And the reason I call it that is because its function is that it prevents large molecules and substances from permeating the epithelium, or at least below the epithelium. So one of the things you're going to learn when we look at this under a microscope, or if we look at this in detail, is that my epithelial cells will take on different shapes, but they're all squished together. And in between those epithelial cells, if I can magnify those connections, those walls are closely stuck together, but stuck in the walls of these epithelial cells are proteins that kind of tie the cells together. By the way, those proteins that interconnect these cells are called cell adhesion molecules. Cell adhesion molecules are proteins that connect all these epithelial cells to each other and hold them together so that they don't all just fall off the body when we rub them. And sometimes we have many layers of these epithelial cells stacked on top of each other. And these cell adhesion molecules would be interconnecting these cells to each other in ways that prevent them from being just rubbed off of our bodies. Now, the first layer of the basal lamina is this thick layer of protein filaments and fibers. They're all crisscrossed. All these protein fibers go in every which direction. And some of those cell adhesion molecules actually attach to those fibers and prevent our skin from sliding off. But really, one of the functions of this is, if I have some substance, a bacterium or virus or something, or even if you're just soaking in a tub filled with, salts or sugars or something, some of those molecules are going to try to diffuse down inside of here, and they will get trapped in this network. It's almost like a little filter. And if there's another large molecule, like a protein, that's trying to diffuse out of the body, it gets trapped and cannot penetrate that lamina lucida. So the lamina lucida acts like a sealer, and as the epithelium sits on top of it, it prevents other molecules that can penetrate between the epithelial cells and the underlying connective tissue. It prevents them from escaping or entering the body. So it prevents molecules from permeating or passing into or out of the body. Now, the second layer of the basement membrane is called the lamina densa. Dense means thick, and it's a much thicker layer. It is also an interconnected network of protein fibers. Both of these layers are protein fibers. But the difference is this. I refer to this as the Velcro of the body. If you've ever ripped Velcro apart, you see all the little hooks and pieces that interconnect, and they hold things together for attachment. And this sort of attaches the epithelium to the underlying connective tissue. And that's exactly what this layer does. And these thick layers of proteins, fibers that are all interconnected, are all attaching this lamina lucida and the epithelium with its cell adhesion molecules to the underlying connective tissue. So this would be your lamina densa. It's a much thicker layer of interconnected proteins, but they help connect or hold this off so that we can't just rip this tissue off. There's actually a genetic disorder where people don't produce some of these proteins, and there's a show on, I don't know, Discovery or one of the science channels called The Boy Whose Skin Fell Off. And if you've ever watched it, it's pretty interesting. He has a disease where he doesn't make the connective, the basement membrane, and if you rub his skin, it just rubs the skin right off and he starts bleeding. So he lived most of his life like a mummy, surrounded in bandages, and had a very difficult life. He eventually passed. Actually, if you watch the show, and you should, it's interesting. It'll provide a unique perspective, because many of the things that we complain about, you realize there's always someone who has it worse than you. You don't have a lot to complain about. Anyway, so I wanted to get through this stuff with you in this first video. We have the basement membrane with its two layers, the lamina lucida, the sealer, and the lamina densa, the Velcro, that prevent molecules from penetrating the body and also help attach the epithelium to the underlying connective tissues. Now, before I go any further, actually, let me just go ahead and do this. I'm going to move on to the actual epithelial tissues, at least a basic introduction of epithelium. And this is the part that should help you for the lab, so that when we study the tissues in lab, it will make sense. So now, let me erase all this. I hope you got all that. And we will do different types of epithelial tissues, okay? So, when it comes to our tissues, one of the things that makes each tissue unique to the other is, one, what are the types of cells found in the tissue? And number two, what are the fibers, or what is the matrix of the tissue made up of? Matrix is sort of, it's everything that's within the tissue that is outside the cells. So if I had a room full of people in this classroom, we would be the cells. The air between our bodies, the tabletops, the columns, the chairs, everything outside your body would be the matrix of the tissue, what the cells live in. For most cells, that's either a syrupy matrix or a very thick gel-like matrix. When it comes to the different tissues, the matrix for epithelium, connective, muscle, and neural is different. And the types of cells, the cells populations of each tissue are different. So, now before I get into that, what I want to go over is the shapes and how we come up with the names of epithelial tissues. When it comes to identifying epithelial tissues, when we look at the name of an epithelial tissue, all the names of epithelial tissues do this. There's two words in the name, and then you'll see epithelium or epithelial tissue. Now, the first word in the name tells you the number of cell layers above the basement membrane. I'm just going to put BM for basement membrane. So the number of cell layers between the outside world and the basement membrane is how we come up with the first word in the name of an epithelium. And usually there's only two major names. There's some additional ones, but these are the ones we're going to deal with for now. If it is called a simple something epithelium, that means it is a single layer of cells between the basement membrane and the outside world. If it is called a stratified something epithelium, that means there are two or more layers of cells between the basement membrane and the outside world. Now I'm going to explain what I mean in just a second. The second word in the name of the tissue tells you the cell shape. Now I'm going to start real basic and then I'll get a little bit more complex, okay? So this tells you the number of cell layers. The second word tells you the shape of the cells. When it comes to epithelial tissues, there are three basic shapes that we could look at. One of those shapes is said to be squamous epithelium. S-Q-U-A-M-O-U-S, squamous. Squamous means squished or squashed, or it means flat. These are very flattened cells. They're very thin. I like to think of them as fried eggs. Give me just a second. I want to look at something on my camera here and make sure I have plenty of room to keep writing. So when I look at these cells, they're going to look like a little egg frying in a pan. The dark spot in the middle would be the nucleus. This would be the cell membrane, and that would be the cytoplasm. And these cells would be sitting next to each other like this. Now, if I could pick those up with a spatula and turn it sideways, they would be sitting like this. They would be very thin layer of cells. So if I'm looking under a microscope and I see a single layer of flat-looking cells, I see a basement membrane, and then I see some kind of underlying connective tissue down here. This would be the outside world out here, and I'm seeing that. That would be called simple squamous epithelium, or simple squamous epithelial tissue, because there's a single layer of cells. If I look under a microscope and I see multiple layers of these cells piled up on top of each other, 2, 4, 40, 200, it doesn't matter. Anything greater than 1, then what I have now is called stratified squamous epithelium. So the first word tells you how many layers of cells, the second word tells you the shape, okay? And if I could look down on top of this tissue, it would look like a sea of fried eggs. So that is squamous epithelium. Now, a second shape that epithelial tissues can come in is called cuboidal epithelium. And it is somewhat cube-shaped. Or one way they describe it in the book is these cells are as wide as they are tall. They tend to be like little cubes, like this. And they have a centrally located nucleus. So if I see some short, squat-looking cells that are cube-shaped, that would be called cuboidal epithelium. Now, if I have some kind of underlying connective tissue, and I have a basement membrane, and I have a single layer of these cube-shaped cells like this, with their nuclei in here, they're not going to be perfect cubes, but if I asked you to identify that tissue under a microscope, you would say simple cuboidal epithelium, because there's a single layer between the basement membrane and the outside world. If I saw two or more layers of these cells stacked on top of each other, we would call that stratified cuboidal epithelium. Put one of these two words with one of these words, and you have the name. Okay? Now the third shape that we're going to talk about, and again, there are some additional shapes and some unique ones. We're not going to get into too much detail. But another shape that these cells can come in is called columnar cells, or columnar epithelium. It has the word column in it, and these are long, tall, slender cells. They tend to be shaped like this, and they're all crammed together next to each other, and they tend to be very tall, skinny cells. Because they're so tall and skinny and squeezed next to each other, the nucleus in these cells tends to be sort of this elongated oval mass. So if I looked under a microscope and I saw a single layer of these cells above a basement membrane with some underlying connective tissue, then this entire layer of cells all the way across would be called simple columnar epithelium. It's a single layer of tall, slender cells. If I had multiple layers, then it would be called stratified columnar epithelium. Okay? So now, so far we have 6 different tissues we can look at. Simple squamous epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium, stratified cuboidal epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium, stratified columnar epithelium. There's another one called pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We'll talk about that one when the time is appropriate. And then there's another type of epithelium called transitional epithelium. When we transition from one type to another, in the middle, the cells kind of look different. They're just, I don't know. I'll show you sometime and we'll talk about it in the future when the time is appropriate. So now, you have a basic understanding of the 4 major tissue types and their basic functions. You know some details about epithelial tissues, like it's avascular, it covers and lines the surface, always has a basement membrane underneath it. You know the 2 layers of the basement membrane, and you know the basic names of the epithelials, of the epithelial tissues, and what these words mean. So, I'm going to cut this video there. If you're going to study for lab, this is the stuff I want you to know for lab, because these are the terms that we're going to use to identify the tissues. This is also the basics for the lecture test 2 of the beginnings of histology. In my next video for lecture, I'm going to go over the different types of epithelium and what their location and function is. For lab, we're going to go over the actual slides. So when you watch the slides of the epithelial tissues and some other tissues, you'll understand what we're talking about.